Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Professor Kate Ritchie, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. Hi, Professor Ritchie. How are you today?
Hey, Saurish, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. Thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussion, I asked all my guests this question just because I think there's so many fascinating stories out there. But I wanted to ask you as well, how did you get into philosophy and what stood out to you?
Yeah, I first got into philosophy in a sort of more official format. I think I'd sort of thought philosophically as a kid and teenager, but I first got into what I thought of as philosophy as an undergrad at Lewis and Clark College, which is a little liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon. Um, and I took a class my first semester of my freshman year and liked it, thought it was sort of weird, but kind of started to get into it. And then I really decided I wanted to study philosophy more when I was in a class and we were discussing the work of different sort of existentialist and other philosophers in like roughly that era. And we're having a discussion about what I think it was Sartre would have said about a particular topic. And we were sort of engaging and figuring out that you could sort of like think within his system. And I thought that was super cool that this is a kind of way, philosophy, one of the things it does is it sort of like allows you to understand how systems of thought work, and you can sort of like learn the rules and then see how they kind of work. And I thought that was super interesting. And I don't do historical work in philosophy now, but that's sort of what got me into it.
I also think it's like really cool in the way in which like philosophy, you produce like texts of information and then like later, even after you've passed away, people are still interpreting those texts. Like I think the legacy portion of philosophy is pretty interesting. But
Yeah.
was there like a specific like kind of moment in before college that you were like into philosophy, or was it something that you picked up once you were in college?
I mean, I think there wasn't like a particular moment that like stands out to me as a child, but one thing that did come to mind is so I do some philosophy of language now, so I think we're mostly going to talk about some of my work in metaphysics or ontology, but I do some philosophy of language too. And I remember going on a hike. I was probably like 7 years old and was thinking about the meanings of different words, sort of like how many, like if you say there's like many apples, or if you say there's a few apples, like how many does that require? And this is actually something that philosophers of language and linguists sort of try to formalize. And I realized later on that I was like trying to do that even as a little kid. So I think I was sort of doing, interested in this sort of like categorization work and what things are. And I mean, I think so many people are interested in that. You really see that with children, I think, trying to figure out the world. So I think a lot of that sort of like early curiosity people have generally is something that I had too. And then I sort of saw some of the connections to philosophy. As I guess a young adult in college.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think like everyone, you like you said, has those experiences. I just think that like maybe philosophy isn't really there in our kind of high school education
Yeah.
as it is. Like I know it's like required in a lot of other countries, at least some for form of philosophy or ethics class, but the United States doesn't have that. Just food for thought, I guess. But like we'll move on to I guess talking about ontology and metaphysics, and I guess specifically social structures and groups. And before I get into like the specifics of any of your work you've produced, I wanted to ask kind of the distinction between metaphysics and ontology, and I guess what the field of ontology really is. What exactly is it? Like what are some of the central questions that you explore in ontology, and how does it differ from questions of metaphysics?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so metaphysics and ontology are sort of one large branch of philosophy. So sometimes the words are just used interchangeably, and sometimes there's a slight distinction in the way people sort of draw them out. But generally, what people are getting at, if they are asking ontological questions or metaphysical questions, is they're asking questions about what sorts of things there are, what sorts of things exist. So are there people? Are there ghosts? Are there numbers? Are there economies? So asking these sort of are there questions? Do these sorts of things exist? And then also asking questions about the nature of certain sorts of entities. So you might be like, yeah, of course there are people. Like, we're not even, that's a silly question. It just seems so obvious. But you might then think, here's a question that's less obvious. Like, what are people? And you might think, well, there's human beings, they're biological, we're animals or something. But a lot of philosophers have thought about different sorts of views of personal identity. So sort of ways you might think personal identity maybe relates to physical bodies, but also maybe relates to minds or souls or memory, or different sorts of identities that might be constructed. So those would all be sort of answers to some of these nature questions. So you've got the kind of existence questions, are there these things? And then also the nature questions, supposing there are, what are they like?
That's really interesting. And I think also like I guess this is broadly related to kind of ontology in general, but I've read a lot about kind of ontology, like I guess like in critical race theory. And so the word ontology to me, and the way I think about these two distinctions between ontology and metaphysics is, for example, like Calvin Warren has a book on metaphysics of like blackness as a whole, and then I guess like a lot of critical scholars talk about blackness in the context of ontology, right? And so that's why I was like wondering, is there really a distinction? Because like when you get into the nitty gritty, it almost seems like they're really similar
Yeah.
in the way. And like I think some philosophers actually consider like ontology to be a like considered underneath the realm of metaphysics, like as a part of it. So I think like those things are really, really interesting. But I did want to clarify just for any of like the audience members who may not be familiar with it. And then specifically on like your research, you've written this paper called Social Structures and the Ontology of Social Groups. What was the purpose behind that paper? Is it just kind of like clarifying how we formulate these groups in the first place? Is there not any exploration in the field already of that? Or like what was kind of like, the reason for writing that paper in the first place?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so there definitely is work in philosophy on the nature of different sorts of groups. And I think, right, some of the critical race theory, some work in feminist philosophy is looking at the nature of groups like racial categories or gender categories. And then there's also work on things like societies or nations, and things also like committees and teams and like high school classes, where you're sort of thinking about those kinds of groups. So part of what led me to write this particular paper was sort of thinking about what these sorts of groups might have in common and what also kind of might mark them out as different. So if you sort of ask someone to brainstorm some social groups, like what's an example of a social group? Like maybe someone's going to list their favorite band, or maybe they're going to list their favorite team, like football team or something. Or maybe they're going to say like families and like women and people who are racialized as Black. And they sort of go through those sorts of examples. And it's like, those sort of seem different, right? Like they all seem groupy, like there's people in them, but they kind of seem different too. So part of the aim in this paper was to sort of extend a view I'd argued for a little bit in an earlier paper on sort of thinking about social structures, and which I take to be things that like have sort of positions or roles that people might occupy, and they can sort of be sort of internal to a group. So you might think about a baseball team. It sort of has an internal structure. We've got pitchers and catchers and so on, and people are related within that team. But you might also think other sorts of groups, like maybe racial groups or socioeconomic classes, are also dependent on social structures, just in a sort of broader, more society level or external kind of way. So I was sort of thinking, by thinking about social structures, we can actually see some ways these groups are similar. Their social structures are central to both, but also different in important ways too.
So real quickly here, I guess I just wanted to ask, because I was thinking about it, in these social, I guess, like networks and structures, is there a relationship between, I guess, the evolutionary perspective of how groups formate or like formulate? For example, I guess like if you go back to like hunters and gatherers, right? You had like those specific groups of people who had like a skill and a craft, and they would do those things for the preservation of a colony, or like of a group of people, which I guess is another group, but like a cohort of people, right? So are those things kind of ways in which we can interpret groups, like group creation and group formation? Is that something that you have like looked at in your paper, or what was kind of like the theory? I think you like deem it like the structuralist ontology of social groups centered around social structures. Like, what is that?
Yeah. Cool question. Yeah. Right. So, yeah, I'm not, let's see. So to say a little bit more about the view and then to get on to sort of thinking about this evolutionary question. So, right, the view is basically that social groups are come in sort of two varieties at least. So some have an internal social structure. So if you ask like what is what is a band, or what is a committee, what is the Supreme Court, it's not just a bunch of individual people, but it's it's both the structural element and the individuals that occupy or play the roles in that structure. What are groups like racial or gender groups? They're more like positions in, or they're sort of situated at particular nodes or positions in these larger structures. So the structuralist view is sort of saying, when we think about social groups, social structures are really relevant, and they're relevant in this important sort of, or in this sort of central way. Either the group is sort of situated at a position, or it's something that has this structure sort of internal to it. But yeah, I think this question about evolution and like how might these roles come about is a really good one. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I thought about a little bit that I think connects up with this is sort of why it is we might rely on social structures. So think about even like an interaction you might have between someone at the grocery store. So you're buying groceries, you're checking out at the grocery store. There's these kind of roles you're playing, right? Like one of you is the customer, one of you is the cashier, and it structures the kinds of interactions you're going to have, right? So you're going to know, like, you put your things on the belt and they like bring them up and you pay for it. And so you're not sort of coming up there and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? Like, I have no idea. We have this sort of setup that allows things to function quite smoothly. And I think like that's part of why, I don't know. I mean, this is not a very, it seems like that's part of what's going on in sort of evolutionary history too. Like, what's going to make for well-functioning societies? Well, we could all individually try to learn how to do absolutely everything, but that's just not going to work as well, right? We're going to be able to do a lot more if some people specialize in hunting, and some people specialize in gathering, and some people, specialize in building houses, and you sort of can divide up these different tasks, and that makes it just easier for us to have, easier for us to do things, and easier for us to build up large scale societies too. Yeah, so it does seem like there's those kinds of structural kind of division of labor things that show up there, and that might be kind of like re-entrenched or something into some of these kinds of social roles. Like particularly, I'm thinking now about like roles in a committee or in a sports team or something like that.
So I have like two questions now, just going on this like evolutionary train of thought. So the first one kind of revolves around different cultures and how different cultures formulate different groups, because obviously social groups can be varied depending on what culture you're in, or like or go to, or region you go to. So I'm wondering how like in ontology, and like I guess in the field of of metaphysics, how are you able to like describe all of those cases underneath a one view? Because like, there's probably like thousands of cases that break some sort of view, which I guess would be like a telltale for like why that view might not be correct, right? But like, it's just those really niche cases, right? So like, how do we construct, or how does one construct a theory or some sort of examination of social structures as a whole that includes all of those various cases?
Yeah, good. Right. So I think the structuralist kind of view is sort of helpful in this, in that, so what's central to the view is that there are these social structures that sort of have positions and relations between them, but it doesn't say like, these are the relations that have to be there, or these are the sorts of features that have to characterize who can play a certain position. So it could be the case that, in some societies, to yeah, to play a role in some government body, you have to like you have to have been born in that country and be over 35 and have some other feature, and have a friend who did such and such, like whatever, right? We could sort of build in whatever. But the particular sort of relations or features that are required can vary quite a lot. So it's kind of like the structuralist view is sort of like this kind of schema or template that I think could be used to understand a lot of different cases, because various different things can be built in, things related to needing to be from the place, needing to have a certain ethnicity, needing to have a certain amount of money, like all of those sorts of things could be deemed relevant or irrelevant based on other sorts of social factors, like what people believe or what people accept, or sort of historical conditions, all sorts of things like that. So in that way, I'm not saying like the view can definitely capture everything. I'm sure there's problem cases it can't handle. That's just how theory works. But I think there is like a lot of flexibility. So it's not like it can only capture groups in the US today or something. I think it can do a lot more than that.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess like also like a central part of like social group formation is I guess psychology, right? Because like you're obviously psychologically thinking about formation of groups. And so I wonder what the relationship here is between like philosophy and psychology when delving into work. Like can you describe that? Do you have to read psychology research to formulate these things? Or like what is the bridge between these two fields?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's sort of a bunch of different places, I think, where philosophy and psychology can come together. And I've actually recently been working with a few psychologists on some projects as well. So I do also read psychology, and now I've been collaborating with some psychologists. One thing we've been working on that's really closely related to this sort of social structuralist view, I've been working on with a couple colleagues at Yale and a colleague at NYU, is sort of looking at whether it seems like people represent groups as having structures. So we ran some little experiments online. So this is one thing psychologists do, is sort of you set up little vignettes, little stories, and you have people read them. And then it's like, what do you think? Like, are there two groups or one group? That's sort of how we set it up here. So we, discussed a club that's a chess playing club and a flower arranging club. We said there's all the same, turns out that all the members of this club are also members of this club. So they have exactly the same individuals in them, but they have sort of different rules or different structures. So like one plays chess one on Mondays and the other arranges flowers on Tuesdays. And then asked people if there was one club or two. I don't know what it seems like to you. It seemed like to us there people would say two, and that the right answer is two. And that's what we found. And we sort of ran other studies trying to look at what happens when if you sort of explicitly merge the structures, does that lead people to think that there's now just one group? And we found yes, that does lead people to think there's just one group. So I guess this is a case kind of where, or I think these studies are sort of looking at what some view in philosophy might show about how people actually do think about at least some kinds of groups, like clubs, for instance. And we looked at things like tribes and committees and departments too. But I think going the other way, there's all sorts of important connections too, right? Like you were sort of getting at, like thinking about how it is that I don't know, sort of underlying beliefs people might have, how that might be relevant, like how someone might identify might be relevant. There's just a huge literature on sort of in-group, out-group phenomena in psychology, especially focused on things like race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, but even really like minimal things like what are sometimes called minimal groups, where you basically just like hand out red t-shirts and blue t-shirts, or red stickers and blue stickers, and kids or adults put them on, and then right away start like, if they were in a blue sticker, they're like, yeah, blues, like the blues are cooler or like more trustworthy, or all sorts of kind of wild things come out when you'd think like, you just put on a blue sticker. This isn't like your family member who you've known for years, or your best friend, or right. So it seems like groups have this like really pervasive ability to affect how we think about things, how we empathize, how we remember. So I think a lot of that is just super interesting. And then I think it also could relate to, how these groups come to be. It seems like they can come to be through um, us seeming to think there's a group, and then that can already sort of like get the ball rolling for maybe building up some like social structure around this group of people that could maybe be captured on this sort of structuralist view.
So when we're looking at like these two fields, like psychology and philosophy, is it like psychology confirms philosophy theory, or psychology informs the way in which philosophy is written or like theories are constructed? Because I imagine like if you're kind of like trying to summarize how social groups are created among humans, it would probably require a lot of human input or besides just your own. And I guess like that's why like collaboration and just discussion is such a valuable part of philosophy. But like, is this the like a common case where science informs philosophy and philosophy also informs psychology?
Yeah, I think this is a case where, at least the way I think of metaphysics or ontology, I think there's sort of room to go both directions. I mean, I think some philosophers are going to say, well, if we're trying to figure out like what the nature of a reality is really like, what the nature of the world is really like, which is kind of like one way of getting at what ontology or metaphysics is doing, they might say like, who cares what people think? Like, it's like, who cares if you sort of went to the physicist and said like, this doesn't really fit with like how I commonsensically think about things. The physicist is just going to say like, okay, like I don't care, like it doesn't really matter. That's not going to make me think my view is wrong. So I think sometimes in ontology, people are like, psychology is just completely irrelevant. But I think social ontology, which is the sort of area of ontology or metaphysics that I work in, is at this sort of interesting point where it does seem like it's not the case that how we think about things, I think always is going to tell us like about how the social world is. I can say more about that in a minute, but it does seem like, if we're looking at the nature of social groups and social systems, it does seem like things about our psychology, maybe which are obvious to us, maybe which are not obvious to us, do seem relevant. Yeah, and I guess sort of getting at this like things that might not be obvious to us or things we might not understand. So if you right, so thinking about stuff in critical race theory, for instance, so thinking about sort of thinking about sort of systematic forms of oppression and how those might create different sorts of social groups. So there, it might not seem obvious to people that race is a social phenomenon, that like racialization isn't just like this biological thing that's based just on evolution. It's like, no, that's, I mean, critical race theorists, and I agree with this, that's I think a lot of social metaphysicians agree with this too. It's like race isn't just this like biological phenomenon. Like race is a social thing that's built up through who has privileges and who doesn't, and who's oppressed in various ways, and what norms are taken to apply to people. And yeah, so there, that might be something where it's like, at least if people psychologically reflect on things, we might actually find, and psychologists sometimes do find, like in some of their studies, that people do think race is like just a natural phenomenon. And then, sociologists and some social metaphysicians can come in and sort of say like, well, we think that people are wrong about that. And here's how we can explain like how these patterns in terms of like racism or racialization develop, and how they develop partially based on, interactions between people, but not necessarily like something that's like clear, obvious to individual people and how they're representing things.
Okay, awesome. I think that clears up in like how like the distinction and kind of the domain, like what they cover and what they're supposed to do as a field. And I guess you kind of like answered this in this and like in your past answer, but what are like the real world effects besides I guess racialization and gendered violence, or like I guess genderization, is that the term? I don't know. But like how can like group construction be used? And I don't know, the way I was thinking about it is like in terms of law, like for example, when like there's gang charges, for what reason do you like presuppose that there's a gang, or like
Mhm.
how do you construct a gang in the first place? What deems you a part of a gang? Like those are the questions that came into my mind when I was thinking about some like potential real world effects. But are there any other like real world effects, and how I guess philosophy can be used in those areas, to guide, I guess, like justice, or like guide other different things, or outcomes?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, and I haven't thought much about the connection to gangs, but I think that is a really a really good question, and sort of thinking about like what is a gang. Yeah, I think, I mean, often the way the media portrays gangs, it's sort of like there's like a mastermind, and there's like all this structure inside of the gang, and like plans are being formulated. But I mean, I think well, again, I'm not an expert on gangs, but they're also like young adults who are in like they're like groups of friends, right? And like sometimes they're maybe are engaged in things that are illegal, and but sometimes, I don't know, it's a group of friends, and they're not these like heavily structured sort of CIA-esque kind of operatives or something. So I think, yeah, I think sort of looking at the ways like gangs might be structured, and are these more sort of like informal groups of friends, are these more like heavily structured sort of entities? I think that's something that yeah, philosophers could potentially shed some light on. Another thing, another way I think metaphysics, social metaphysics, has a role to play in sort of real world implications is in this sort of two-part, I guess, way I sort of think about how one might carry out social justice projects, or any project sort of aimed at making the world a better place. So it seems like if you're going to try to figure out how to sort of solve some problem or make things better, like try to have a more just society, you need to sort of understand where we are to begin with, right? Sort of like, if I don't know the starting point, like how am I going to start moving on? So I think if you're doing social metaphysics, you can, like, part of what one's doing in studying questions about groups, say, is sort of looking at the nature of different kinds of groups that exist now. And you might see, like, yeah, there's all sorts of groups that are rooted in oppression, that involve things like subordination, that involve things like undue privilege, or having certain sorts of norms put in place about what one has to do. And sometimes that's sort of really built into the group itself, and sometimes that's built into the structure of like a larger society. So sort of, I don't know. So thinking about like what it is to be an immigrant, maybe an immigrant in the US, you can think about like what it is to be an immigrant, but you can also think about, how immigrants in the US versus in some other countries might be situated based on different sorts of policies, and how that could affect, sort of like the experiences of being an immigrant in the US versus the experience of being an immigrant in some other country. And I think, philosophers are doing things at a pretty abstract level. So that's a common sort of thing. But I think getting some of this like descriptive work, sort of to understand the nature of different kinds of groups, the nature of different kinds of relations or norms, those sorts of things. I think that can be helpful in sort of then thinking like, okay, so if here's where we are, how do we sort of move forward to change things so that we can have a more just world, a world with less oppression, a society that's more equal, and so on.
That makes sense. And I just kind of want to clarify one thing about, like, I guess your research in social ontology. Is it meant to kind of describe what is or what should be? Like, I know like a lot of times philosophy is describing like what ought be, like what ought to be. Is that what social ontology does, or are you describing what is and what is seen in the world?
Um, yeah, that's also a great question. I think it's more focused on what is than some areas of philosophy, but I don't think that's, yeah, but I mean, I think it's kind of a hard question to answer, sort of like it's definitely this or it's definitely this, because I think they sort of are meant to fit together. But But at least if you're asking this sort of question, like like what are gender groups, what are racial groups, what are teams, what are whatever, like those are going to be questions about like what are they, like sort of these is questions rather than the ought questions. But you could sort of start with the is question, you know, sort of this is how things seem to be now, and then you could, you know, I think then use that to support really like implementing some of the answers to these ought questions. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So like almost like a conjunction of both.
Yeah.
Okay, definitely. That makes sense. I just wanted to confirm because like I know some fields are really specific that it's just like what ought be. Like for example, if you're talking about like, I don't know, normative ethics, like those are kind of things about like what you should, like what you ought be doing based off of this, like whatever information you have or like whatever, yeah, like different theories, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But I just wanted to confirm kind of what social metaphysics is meant to do. But it seems like it's a little bit of both almost, especially I guess we were talking about like the science aspect of it that kind of describes like the what is, like how people actually treat groups right now, and then maybe like the theoretical formation is also like a bridge into like what could be, what should be almost,
Yeah.
and how we interpret groups.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it does do this sort of bridging work, whereas like a lot of metaphysics, I think, is like just the kind of like what is question. So if you're asking like what are numbers, it's not like what should numbers be, or like what is time. It's not like what should time be. It's
Yeah.
like just like let's understand what this is. And then right, there are ethical questions about how should we act, what should adjust, like what's a good society look like. And then social metaphysics is kind of in this funny place where it's like we're sort of trying to ask questions about like, yeah, what are economic systems like, what are groups like, what are societies like, but then like right away it's sort of, you know, that just like leads you into these questions about like how things should be, especially because very often we find you know, unfortunately, that the world's not a just place. Like groups are really central to all sorts of forms of oppression and so on. Yeah, so that's sort of like right away you're like, well, if there's oppression, clearly that shouldn't be the case. Like we shouldn't have groups that are sort of you know, that are centrally defined in terms of subordination relations or something. So that looks like right away we ought to be changing things.
Right, definitely. And I think you know, like the first half is like the what is often why metaphysics seems so abstract. But I guess like it's a healthy bridge to have something, you know, more about like the what ought be, because I think those questions, at least me personally, like those are more engaging sometimes because you know you can get caught up in the abstract so much. But I did want to talk about kind of your paper about does identity politics reinforce oppression, which I think is a really hot topic right now, given kind of like the political climate and how different you know, like different groups of individuals have produced a lot of content and a lot of literature in I guess identity politics. And so I wanted to know like specifically what identity politics is, and how frequent it is in terms of like the problem that you're trying to talk, like the problem you're talking about in terms of like how it could potentially lead to oppression. How frequent is that? Because I think a lot of times people will think of identity politics but not necessarily equate it to oppression or how it could produce oppression. So I wanted to know like what is the scope of that problem specifically?
Yeah. So I think right. So I think identity politics as a sort of label is used in all sorts of different ways. And one criticism you see sometimes is that like by focusing on identities, we're actually going to just lead to more and more factions. We're not going to be unifying. And maybe moreover, like one's going to sort of become more connected to these sorts of issues one's faced in terms of oppression, or issues one's faced in terms of negative aspects of one's life. So you're sort of like holding close to these like negative things. And if you're doing that, like, how is that going to lead to sort of things getting better? In fact, it's just going to sort of further entrench these sort of negative things in society. So, right, if we think of identity politics as something like political mobilization political mobilization sort of centered on identities, maybe things like race, gender, sexuality, centered on identities, that's aimed at liberation or sort of making things better, making things more just. I think the sort of challenge that I was considering in this paper is that, well, if these identities are really like if these identities are sort of inherently, like constitutively, like really by their very nature tied to some form of oppression or tied to some form of subordination, if you're sort of holding on to that and like entrenching it further, sort of, like then that oppression or that subordination is sort of not going to go away. I don't know if that's like making the most sense, but yeah, I mean, the idea is sort of like, if you have something that's like, it's like this thing by its very nature involves oppression, and then you're like, I want to keep that. It's like, wait a minute, like that seems like you want to keep something oppressive. So that's the kind of problem that that's been posed by op-ed writers, by political theorists, by lots of people, and I am grappling with that in this paper.
Yeah, definitely. I can understand that. So for me, just like a brief, like, oh, the way I interpret it, or identity politics is kind of like a way of, embracing yourself within the struggle. Or that's how I've kind of interpreted identity politics. So I wonder, like, what is your conclusion in this paper? Like, what kind of do you gravitate towards in terms of like a yes or no, or maybe it's not even a yes or no, it's like a case by case maybe situation. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so in the paper, I basically argue that the answer is no. So it's not the case that I think no identity politics ever could lead to more oppression, but I think that at least it's not sort of so sometimes this challenge is posed as a kind of like trying to be a kind of global takedown of identity politics, sort of like we've got you now, like there's no way you can actually engage in like reasonable identity politics. Why? Well, because you're just saying like, yay, I love my oppression, and also I'm going to try to get rid of oppression. You can't do both of those. So I think that is I think that's a bad argument. And how I argue for the conclusion in the paper is by thinking more about the nature of groups. And I say, I argue that while like racial groups or sexuality groups or ethnic groups like are groups, like once you're engaged in identity politics, you're like doing some political mobilization, right? Like you're like engaging in this struggle that's not just sort of like something one has to do in order to be someone who has some ethnic identity or racial identity or gender identity. It's like doing some real work, right? And that work, I think, involves a change in the group. Like now you're becoming something more, I mean, you're mobilizing, right? Like you're becoming engaged in some kind of organizing work, some kind of activist work. If you're doing that, you're not sort of just someone who, like, to kind of use the way I'd been thinking of it, someone who's just like positioned in a social group that's in this larger social structure. You're actually like actively engaging, maybe maybe like taking on some role in a struggle that's not sort of just something that comes automatically with being Black or being a woman or whatever, being queer or anything like that.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess like I did want to ask like one question kind of based off of this paper, which is like a really hot take, and I guess it's just my curiosity here. But is it ethical? And I know this is like ethics, and I don't know, maybe if that's like not, I guess your central field, but like to admit students, and this is a college question based thing, based off of identities in the name of diversity. And I guess like this isn't necessarily about colleges, but like I guess broadly speaking, is it okay to like be friends with a specific group of people because of their identity or things like that? Is that like an ethical thing to do, or do we have to treat all humans kind of as the same agent and give them the benefit of doubt regardless of whatever their identities are? Because like I can see how this is like a really central question now for
Yeah.
students, for kind of admissions anywhere, and then also like just in general, it is a really big thought puzzle of like, how can I become like a better person in terms of how I'm like thinking about these different things? Because a lot of the times you'll kind of form biases that you don't really challenge, and by not challenging them or recognizing them, you can just kind of like recreate those biases. So
Yeah.
I guess like it's a good time to like reflect on that. You don't have to answer in the context of colleges, but I'm just setting the scene.
Yeah, yeah. Right. I think there are, yeah, really important questions, yeah, surrounding sort of like how to treat people as individuals and how to treat people, or not like treat people. I guess we should be treating people with respect and all of that, but sort of like, yeah, thinking about sort of behavioral dynamics, both at an individual level and at an institutional level, given sort of that people are individuals and also that people have group identities, that have a lot of history and that have a lot of power. Yeah, so I mean, I think that in thinking about things like affirmative action, I mean, I think the idea that people have been, that individuals have different constraints and enablements, or different ways in which they're privileged, different ways in which they lack privilege or are subordinated. Like I think that that is the case. Like I think that does happen, and I think most people will accept that. So then I think then there's this like, yeah, big ethical question of like, well, what do we do to remedy that? Yeah, like does does one appeal to identity-based admissions? Do we look at things like reparations? Like, is that the way to go for certain groups, given the sort of like economic divisions that are systematic and longstanding amongst racial groups in America, say? Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to affirmative action. So I mean, I do think like there is a place for it, when we're thinking about, yeah. I mean, I think when we're thinking about like how to make the world a more just place, but I think that's going to come down to, yeah, not just a metaphysical view. I think one could say like, well, here's the way to understand groups, but I'm just not going to take a stance at all here. Or like one could go in different ways. And yeah, I do think it's like it's a tricky issue that metaphysics, I think, has some role to play, but not too much really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like this is kind of like the fascination, or like the fascinating things about philosophy, in which like this question is like a lot of different fields wrapped together, but it's like based off of like a social ontology question, or ontological question almost.
Yeah.
So I think it's like really cool how they all come together. But like that kind of like wraps up majority of the questions that I had on like your research. And I guess I wanted to ask you kind of what you are doing now, for audience members that may be interested in like following up, or I guess any future UCI students who want to like learn more. What is your research focused on now?
Yeah, let's see. So my research now is still focused on things sort of related to the social world. I've been doing a bit more both in terms of sort of how we represent the world. So right, if we think about sort of ontology and metaphysics as sort of investigating what the world is like, what the world's like. So I'm also sort of interested in how it is that we represent what the world is like, which maybe is accurate, maybe not. So yeah, I'd mentioned this one project I've been working on with some psychologists. I've been doing some other projects with some psychologists on what are called generic constructions. So these are things like bears have fur or birds fly, but like also sort of more socially, politically interesting or kind of fraught ones like women are nurturing, or basically any like stereotype you can think of is often in the form of a generic, where you have like the name or the thing to pick out the social group and then some property that's supposed to hold of them. So yeah, we've been thinking some about just like the properties of these kinds of constructions, how they work, how they seem to maybe be linked up at some points, in some cases to really making people think there is like an underlying essence to that group or category, maybe a biological essence, but in other cases, also making people think that there's like a larger kind of social structure that the group might be situated in. Yeah, so we've been sort of, I've been working on some projects related to generics. And I've also been working recently on some projects related to sort of thinking about how these sorts of social structures might have a role to play in sort of modeling conversations or understanding conversational dynamics. So one thing that philosophers sometimes think about is uh, a distinction between what are called different sorts of speech acts. So you can think about like, what can you do with speech? Like if you think about other kinds of actions, like what kinds of actions can you take? Well, you could like throw a ball, you could like dance, you could jump, you can write a paper or whatever, write a sentence. With speech, we can like ask a question, we can give a command, we can give someone permission to do something. We can just assert something, say something is the case. So there's these different sorts of actions one could take. And this goes back to the work of a philosopher named Austin, J.L. Austin, who was writing in like the 1960s. Yeah, so some philosophers have thought some about the ways in which race and gender, but also things like being a judge or being a senator can affect being the president, can affect sort of how your speech is interpreted. So I've been sort of thinking more about some of these issues too, and whether bringing in sort of social structures, which include these different roles and groups, into a model of conversation might be useful for, yeah, for capturing sort of what's going on a little bit better.
That's really cool. Those are some really interesting questions. And I guess like collaboration in general is like also pretty cool. So especially in like the philosophy world, like I can understand maybe like on like a science project, but like in philosophy, it seems so interesting in the way in which like collaborations work overall in terms of written formula, like in terms of like written text and stuff like that. So those are
Yeah.
really cool questions, as well as kind of like understanding more about the human, which is always super fascinating.
Yeah.
But that about wraps up our episode today. Thanks so much, Professor Ritchie, for coming on. Like I learned a lot about social groups, and there were a lot of fun questions that I had. So thanks so much for your time and for answering them.
Yeah. Thanks, Saurish. It was really great talking to you, and thanks for having me on.